Today, we are very honored to welcome a speaker. Her name is Nicole Hoger, Regional Operations Manager of DACH area, QE GmbH. Nicole graduated in Industrial Biotechnology. She's a professional engineer with advanced knowledge in GXP, business processes, ERP systems, and complex laboratory systems, with expertise in computerized system validation, data integrity, and project management, as well as Agile methodology, traditional project and team management strategies. She has experience in pharmaceutical/biopharmaceutical industry, combined with increasing responsibilities and roles in international pharmaceutical companies. Let's welcome Nicole Hoger on GAMP5, second edition.
Thank you very much, Jen. Thank you very much for your introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this session. Today, we are going to discuss the second
Nicole,
edition.
we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we can hear you. That's fine.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, now it's working. So thank you, everybody, for attending this session today. And thank you for the high amount of attendance on this very interesting topic starting this year. Today, we are going to discuss the second edition of GAMP5 guideline with a main highlight on the differences towards the first edition. Now, starting from an overview, one of the main triggers for publishing the second edition of the guideline was, among others, the global-19 pandemic, which has, of course, influenced our lives towards the past 3 years on several aspects, and of course, especially in the public health environment, in the life sciences industry, in the way in which the life sciences industry can be used to ensure patient safety and product quality, and especially with the increasement of advanced technologies and innovations. So this guidelines has, on one hand, the enhancement and improvement and update of some of the appendixes which were already present in the first edition. And on the other hand, the publication of brand new appendixes, which are focusing on the introduction of concepts which previously were not treated at all. Starting from 5 key concepts which were partially addressed as well in the first edition, the guide is focusing at first instance on the understanding of the processes which are supporting the product production as well as the whole life cycle phase of this computerized system. Understanding the process is the basic information which is needed in order to choose also the correct approach in order to execute the process itself. In fact, the second concept is the concept of the life cycle approach to the quality management system applying critical thinking. We are going to talk extensively about critical thinking in the next minutes of the presentation. This is connected also to the concept of being able to scale life cycle activities. So life cycle activities in the GXP environment, especially as part of the validation framework, are no longer seen as frozen phases which need to be executed one after the other, but they can be scaled under percentage circumstances, and they can be also mixed together and executed through applying more fluid and lean approaches. The science-based quality risk management is a concept that is highlighted, that was present also in the first edition, and the risk-based approach keeps considering the baseline for executing all the approaches throughout the life cycle phases, as well as the involvement of the supplier, but also here the leveraging of the supplier is highly introduced as a concept more than in the first edition. The second edition is focused on several concepts more than new processes themselves. At first, the concept of trying to apply an iterative and incremental method and model in order to execute the validation framework of a system as well as the software development. Here we're talking about Agile. Agile is a concept that has been actually introduced in 2001 through the Agile Manifesto, mainly focused on software development. But this second edition of the guideline is explaining how Agile can be adopted also during the validation life cycle of a computerized system in the counterpart of the waterfall approach, which is the linear approach. Critical thinking application has been already introduced in other guidelines or in other drafts also of the FDA, and is now here published for the very first time in a transversal way through the whole set of processes which are supporting not only the validation phase itself, but also the maintenance phase and the whole life cycle of a computerized system in a GXP environment, with the focus of maintaining a patient-centric view to ensure patient safety and product quality, of course, but also to leverage the information which can be used in order to achieve this goal and to reduce the effort. On the other hand, we see the introduction of several new technologies, as mentioned before. One of them is the use of cloud platforms. Cloud platforms have a main difference compared to standard applications, which influence the role and the need of involvement of the IT service providers, as well as of the infrastructure qualification. On the other hand, automation and tools play a big role in recent years throughout the application of validation processes, especially with the relation to the documentation which has been used so far in order to ensure control over the traceability throughout the validation lifecycle, which can be now partially or completely replaced by tools in order to grant control, quality, and to proceed on a risk-based approach without losing the traceability and to reduce also the human error factor. Moreover, the guideline is introducing some brand new technologies such as artificial intelligence, open source softwares, machine learning, blockchain, and cloud computing. Today, we are going to focus on the validation framework, which is strongly reshaped compared to the first edition of GAMP5. I think everybody is more or less confident who is working in the sector with the concept of the V cycle of a standard validation approach, as we are used to know from the first edition of GAMP5. What is introduced in the second edition is, on one hand, the de-emphasization of the validation master plan. Validation master plans have been used for huge projects which are composed by either more complex systems or enterprise systems which are undergoing several changes over time and that need to be reshaped or they need to be modified through several releases. So the concept of the validation master plan is used, for instance, during the execution of business process redesign projects. In this guideline, however, in this edition of the guideline, it is addressed and recommended to tailor a validation plan, a single validation plan for the systems in scope, as the whole period of the validation framework itself is seen much more as a fluid process, and it's also linked to a different approach to the change management process. This means critical thinking is here applied from the very beginning in order to emphasize the fact that it's no longer recommended to have a strong specification frozen of the requirements which need to be applied throughout the life cycle of the system, but that the requirements and the specifications can be critically changed, reshaped, and corrected throughout the whole life cycle itself. This brings us, of course, again to the Agile approach. Agile, like we will see later, is an incremental iterative approach, which is focusing on a complete different mindset. It's really a cultural shape. It's a shift of the concept of defining at the very beginning of the phase all the requirements which are needed and switching to the concept of continuous improvement and to evolve learning from failure. So the Agile approach is highly supported by the creation of single validation plans and of the reshaping during the process itself, rather than starting from the beginning of a process and correcting only through deviations. Then there is the introduction, of course, of the validation plan for the new applications, which were not in use during the publication of the first edition of the guideline, like, for example, the software is a system solutions, which describe how the regulated company can actually rely on the quality management system of the service provider, and how the service providers and supplier role is higher in this kind of systems, as those systems are cloud platforms that are not relying that much on the underlying IT infrastructure than a standard application. If we proceed during the validation life cycle through the different phases, the standard approach of validation of this P cycle is foreseeing to determine the effort that we need to put into the execution of validation based on a risk-based approach. The risk-based approach is mostly linked to the GAMP software category. Software categories have been described in first edition of GAMP5 and have been used for several years in the life sciences industry to determine the kind of validation approach to be carried out and the amount of effort to be put into the V-cycle execution. This edition is maintaining the categories that we are used to know from the first one, but is highlighting the concept of seeing those categories not as strictly assigned to a single software application, but to look at the software categories more as a continuum, which means a software application based on its complexity as part of a computerized system can be composed of configured components as well as of standard components. Those components can be now categorized with different software categories and can be tested during validation, addressing the effort based on the categorization assigned. This doesn't mean that this can be done with every single validation. This is strongly depending on the system complexity, of course, and on the system novelty. So if we're talking about a prospective or a retrospective validation, this approach may change. However, the goal of this continuum, more fluid approach is also the goal of reducing the effort by providing all the necessary evidence that the system is fit for its intended use. Coming to change and configuration management, as shortly mentioned before, change is something that is now strongly accepted as part of any validation process. There should be different levels of formality and rigor applied while executing changes, either during the validation process itself or during the operational phase of the system. Changes should be strongly documented, and it should be ensured during the whole life cycle of a system that they are traceable and that they are controlled. However, Agile is introduced also here as a tool set to manage requirement changes, which are reflected into the related deliverables, and for the development operations and continuous integration deployment concept, which is typical of the Agile approach, in order to proceed in a release-based approach rather than in a standard linear waterfall-based approach. So traceability of requirements must be ensured, but here, analogously to the validation master plan change, we see a slight difference in this new edition in how those changes can and shall be handled throughout the life cycle. The traceability concept is strongly connected with the concept of documentation. So we live in an area in the regulated environment where we are used to the fact that we need to properly, strongly document every single step, every prescription which is needed to provide the evidence that our computerized system is validated so that it's fit for its intended use. Documenting has been for several years the only way to have information that can be provided in case of inspection, to have information that can provide the evidence that the validation has been performed, that the system is reliable, that the patient safety and product quality is ensured, and this is correct. Here in the second edition, we see a switch from the concept of document to the concept of tool, because through the introduction of new applications and new technological tools that can be used to execute the validation itself, we see a highlight of the switch from the paper-based validation from the validation executed through testing tools. which can be, for example, document management system or electronic testing softwares, applications, which incorporate into one single data set, on one hand, the requirements, on the other hand, the evidences and the tests of the function itself. So we do not have no longer the need to provide a single document for every single deliverable or phase of the validation framework, but we need a tool or a method to ensure full traceability and, very important, which can be filtered. So we need an engine which can be indexed in order to look for the information we look for, provided we are using a tool. The fact that there is no need to create documents only for the sake of inspection is named in the second edition. However, there should be paid very much attention, because this doesn't mean, of course, that documentation is no longer needed. It's a leveraging of those documentation that is not adding a plus value to the evidence of the goal we are looking for. Quality risk management, on the other hand, is mainly unchanged from the previous version. There are mainly some considerations with relation to the use of cloud platforms and applications, because part of the risk management activities are moved outside from the responsibility of the regulated company. But the concept itself of quality risk management throughout the life cycle is still, like in the previous edition, based on the identification of the risk and on the methodology to reduce them to an acceptable level by applying a scalable approach, by trying to move through the different life cycle phases, but maintaining strongly always a risk-based approach for all the processes which are supporting, on one hand, the validation phase, and on the other hand, the operational phase of the system in use. So one of the main concepts which are introduced in the second edition is critical thinking, as mentioned at the early beginning. What is critical thinking? Critical thinking has been already named in previous guidelines, first data integrity by design guidance, which is stating that critical thinking is the process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, evaluating information to reach an answer or a conclusion. What does it mean? It means that overly prescriptive documentation is no longer the starting point. Critical thinking is the concept of relying on the expertise and on the processes within a regulated environment in order to achieve the goal and the reliability of a process related to a GXP system, which is mainly a validation process, but it can be used, for example, also in control processes like, for instance, periodic review or auditory review. Critical thinking is a switch of mindset. The key goal stays unchanged. The goal is still to maintain a system in a status which is fit for its intended use and to ensure control over the life cycle. But the concept of critical thinking is highlighting how much known adding phases and known adding information has been used for several years, and they are actually not contributing to reach this goal and to ensure traceability and enough documentation to ensure the reliability of the process we are executing. Critical thinking application, just to give a couple of examples, is not used only during the validation framework. It's evaluated in order to evaluate, for example, the frequency of all those processes that are risk-based. Also from an organizational point of view or a procedural point of view, as part of processes of deciding supplier assessments or the kind of testing activities that should be executed. So it's really a switch in the mindset, and it is highly reflected in the validation approach and in the way a system, a computerized system with GXP relevance should be tested, but we can see it transversally applied throughout the whole life cycle of the computerized system until the retirement phase of the system itself, and also within different processes of a regulated company, also from a business point of view. Coming a little bit more into detail, into the validation framework. The first edition was composed of 2 appendixes related to requirement specifications. One was linked to user requirement specifications and the other one to functional specifications. The second edition is merging them into one single appendix in order to provide a more comprehensive overview on how requirements should be specified for a computerized system, and which is actually the correct and most effective approach in order to switch from the user requirement specifications to the functional ones and to the testing phase itself. The definition of requirement itself stays unchanged. Requirements should define clearly and precisely what the regulated company requires from the system. And this is pretty much clear in order to meet the system's intended use. And the process needs should also be included. What is different here is that the critical thinking concept is applied at first instance to the definition of requirements. If we have computerized systems, which are categorized mainly as software category 3, it means this system is mainly composed of standard components. Critical thinking is introduced here to say, okay, the specification of requirements can be done in a linear approach, while the full detail is maintained for software applications which have a higher complexity, which means they are categorized as category 4 or 5. In the same way, we see the counterpart of the waterfall and the agile approach in those 2 different situations. So the specification of requirements is strongly different between the agile approach, where requirements can be reshaped within the backlog during the revision of the sprints, and the waterfall approach, where requirements are frozen at the very beginning of the approach and are declined to the whole testing phase, which comes after. There are principles addressed for the specification of requirements, which were also inspectable in previous guidelines, like, for instance, the SMART principle and the INVEST principle. But the big difference from the first edition is the introduction of the critical thinking approach, starting also here from the requirement specification, so at the very beginning of the validation phase. The concept of traceability is introduced also here, linked to the introduction of the tools that we have mentioned before. So as you can see, all the topics that we are addressing now are actually linked together in a transversal way. Reading through the guideline, it becomes very clear how the topics are no longer separated, but they are all interconnected. This is a good example. If thinking of requirements, we know that requirements need to be mapped to specifications, and the specifications need to be covered to testing activities. If a tool is used, and for example, an agile methodology is used, this traceability is automatically ensured, and everything, those 3 components, requirements, specifications, and testing, are embedded within a single tool and a single data set, which is assigned to that computerized system. So introducing automated tools for testing activities or document management, introducing a specific mapping which is automated, reduces on one hand the possibility of human error, and on the other hand ensures automatically the traceability. Supplier, which is the role of the supplier and which is the need for supplier assessment. Any regulated company is forced or should formally assess each supplier operating in providing GXP supporting activities, services, or products. This means each supplier should be assessed by the regulated company in order to ensure that he can provide the level of quality which is necessary for its product or for the service that is requested, and on the other hand, that the supplier is reliable. Here, critical thinking is applied based on the service and on the product that the supplier is providing. For example, the use of cloud platform switches the responsibility much more on the supplier side rather than on the regulated company. So from the infrastructure to the applications. The use of tools, on the other hand, is strongly relying on the supplier, because if using tools, it means that the supplier is the one that ensures our method of executing the validation itself. The company is no longer relying on its own paper-based solution, but is buying a service, which can be a testing tool, for instance, that is responsible for retaining the whole GXP relevant information part already of the validation framework, and not only during the operational phase of the system. Data integrity is strongly focused here. It was present, of course, in the first edition as well, but the concepts of data integrity and regulatory requirements are addressed strongly during this phase, because it's very important to understand that the supplier importance is not reduced, it is just shifted compared to the previous edition. And there is the naming of the possibility to officially recognize virtual online auditing forms. This was also mainly triggered to the COVID-19 pandemic. The approach for the supplier assessment is mainly unchanged. What is mainly changing, and where critical thinking is introduced, is the relationship between the supplier and the regulated company. Based on the categorization of the service and the categorization of the product, the involvement of the supplier can be fully included or only limited to certain parts of the process itself. IT infrastructure is heavily reduced in terms of importance when it comes to cloud platforms, and on the other hand, it is highlighted for the applications it is impacting. There is a strong improvement in the role of quality unit related to IT infrastructure, which is stating that quality units should be less involved for all those parts of IT infrastructure qualification which are not having an impact from a GXP perspective. So there should always be an agreement in place between QA and IT systems, but the role of IT infrastructure and of the quality unit should be spread based on the focus of the application or the focus of the cloud resource. The shape or the definition, as per definition of the cloud resource, is that the GXP relevance is based on the intended use of the cloud platform, and IT infrastructure has now a less great influence. So it doesn't mean that the infrastructure should not be responsibility of the regulated company, but the process is strongly delegated in some cases to the supplier itself. What is very important for the regulated company here is to be aware where the data are stored, so where the GXP data are stored, and to strongly understand where is the boundary between a cloud application or a traditional IT infrastructure framework. Infrastructure is also involving mainly internal and external processes. Here we're talking about, for instance, infrastructure as a code, which means we enable organizations to use, regulated companies to use automation in order to reduce the risk of human error, and the GXP risk for properly managed infrastructures become in this side very relatively low. It means we have a more controlled environment. Switching to one of the latest topics of our presentation, Agile software development, as previously stated, is the process of iterative changes, of ongoing changes. This slide is showing one of the four, to me, more interesting statements of the Agile Manifesto, which has been published in February 2001, so already several years ago, responding to change over following a plan. This means having an approach which is basically coming from the other direction. Agile has been mostly applied so far only to software development, but in this guideline, we can see how it can be applied also in some cases to the validation framework, trying to apply the concept of continuous adjustment based on an Agile framework. There are several frameworks for Agile that can be used. One of the most used one is the Scrum framework. Basically, we have the definition of the baseline requirements in a so-called backlog, which is then developed and analyzed and tested throughout so-called sprints, which are usually lasting no more than 4 weeks. During the sprints, any kind of error that is noticed is sent back in order to be corrected in the backlog throughout regression testing, and it's used for improvement for the next sprint. This means the concept of learning from errors is strongly used here and allows a very fast execution, which is not focused on an error-free trial, but is focused on trying to correct errors which are occurring during the process itself, and not completing a validation framework, which is closed maybe with different deviations that cannot be corrected because it's too late in an effective way. Agile is reflecting the so-called discovery mindset that is encouraging the acting, learning, and continuous and rapid improvement. Being fast is an advantage, but is always risky if the correct approach is not applied. So the discovery mindset is a powerful approach to really change the way teams play and deliver, because in an agile approach, teams are acting together, usually in multidisciplinary teams, and have the possibility to proceed in a faster way, which is more effective for certain approaches. Here, we need to notice the fact that the agile approach cannot be always applied, and it's not replacing the waterfall approach. This is very important to know, but where it is applicable, it can constitute an improvement in the process itself. As a last topic, I wanted to have a highlight on the testing activities. So related to the different concepts we have highlighted so far: critical thinking, agile, leveraging of previous activities, supplier involvement. Testing activities are more or less the highlight of the B cycle. It means the phase in which I'm going to test the specifications which come from the requirements which have been defined for the system in scope. All GXP computerized systems which are used in the regulated industry must be or should be trustfully validated in order to ensure they are fitting their intended use. The testing activities are here described in the second edition, connected to the critical thinking concept and with a highlight on the kind of testing effort which is applied. We see here the introduction, or to better say, the inclusion of the computer system assurance concept, CSA, which is stating the possibility to overcome this concept of highly detailed prescriptive testing, which are not adding a value actually to the testing outcome, and to try to focus rather on which are the important parts of a system to be tested, and to rely, for instance, on the standard components and on the tester's experience. The level of testing should be commensurated to the risk, and it should not be strongly step-by-step defined. So the introduction of unscripted testing techniques is used in CSA for certain risk-based assessments for certain functionalities, and can heavily reduce the effort. The risk-based approach here is on a requirement level. So we no longer start on the risk assessment of the system itself, but we are going to assess the risk of each single requirement. And based on that, the effort of testing can be decided. What needs to be included in the unscripted testing is the experience of the SME and of the tester. This is a precondition to have a successful execution of CSA approach, because the tester is no longer someone who is blindly following instructions, but he needs to have the experience and the expertise to find out the challenges that can be applied to the system itself, and stress and challenge the system in order to discover errors. The use also here of automated tools can be easily merged with the concept of unscripted testing, and also leveraging previously executed tests is applied under some cases, which means supplier testing or testing referred to standard functionalities of the system. So these two new concepts, critical thinking and computer software assurance, are now brought together within the second edition of this guideline. And we can see here the standard pyramid, which sees the documents at the very top and the smallest part. We start from critical thinking approach, which is leveraging the SME's experience during the testing execution. We start introducing the concept that supporting evidence is needed only where it actually brings value, and that time should be saved and error should be saved where possible. Documentation is used at the top only as supporting documentation where it's actually needed. All the rest is based on effective assurance activities. In this last slide, we see an overview of some main differences or pros and cons between the computer system validation approach and the computer software assurance approach. Both are, for example, risk-based, but with a different emphasis. In CSV approach, we see the application of different validation methodologies, which are very strictly ruled and which see a prescriptive step-by-step approach that is necessary based on the complexity of the system. There are some system frameworks which really need a CSV approach. CSA approach based on the risk level of the requirements and the overall risk of the system, on the other hand, allow to apply critical thinking and the application of unscripted testing methodologies. It is important to understand here that CSA is not replacing CSV. Yes, it is a complementary methodology in order to ensure reliability and fitness for intended use for a computerized system. But we need to keep in mind that the very first step is always to execute a risk-based analysis in order to understand which is the best approach that can be applied. So we are not talking about a replacement, we are talking about an integration. So to summarize, the new edition of this GAMP5 guidelines includes, on one hand, very much applications of new technologies, artificial intelligence, and in concepts like cloud computing or blockchains. It highlights the importance of critical thinking, maintaining a patient-centric view and a risk-based approach. It encourages the use of a discovery mindset, which is covering transversally the whole life cycle of a system, starting from the very beginning, the validation phase, up to the operational and retirement phase, and strongly encourages the mindset that we need to apply, in some cases, basic common sense, which should be kept into compliance, which should be used to save cost, time, and effort, and to ensure the reliability and the fitness for intended use of the system, but it can be summarized within the critical thinking concept in a transversal way to be applied throughout all processes of a regulated company. Thank you very much for your attention, and we can start now with question and answers.
Thank you, Nicole, for your fruitful sharing. So from the 5 major changes from the first to second edition of our GAMP5, to the 3 major evolutions from paper signed evidence and the 4 key considerations for validation planning. I hope that we hope that you have found this session as helpful as we have. So we would like to open this session to the questions from the floor. Maybe I can start by getting the ball rolling. So it seems like from your sharing, there will be a more emphasis on the agile methodology and with a more industrial kind of approach rather than having that validation more on the prescriptive step-by-step processes. So what do you foresee are some of the key challenges in this shift?
Yes, so we need to keep in mind that Agile approach is not strictly related to the unscripted use of testing, because Agile is a validation methodology, while unscripted testing is part of the computer software assurance methodology. So those are two different things. Nevertheless, both of them can be observed within the same challenge, which is, in my opinion, linked to be able to properly address the risk. As I said before, the risk assessment at the very beginning of the stage and understanding the complexity and architecture of the computerized system in scope is the only way to properly apply the correct methodology. So the risk is maybe to apply a methodology which is too lean to a computerized system which is too complex and that would actually need a more prescriptive way of documentation in order to prove its fitnesses for intended use. That could be probably the main risk.
Right. So more emphasis on or an integrated approach would be necessary, and that would be some of the key challenges right from the beginning.
Correct.
Next, we have a question on could you share your opinion on changes in supplier management, considering cloud solutions in comparison to the more traditional premise systems? Would we enforce suppliers to be certified in cybersecurity, such as ISO 27001?
In my opinion, yes, we should include this for suppliers for cloud solutions, because we are having a very strong shift on the control that the regulated company can have on the application. So if a regulated company is using cloud solutions, we need to very much strongly rely on the supplier, because the regulated company has less control compared to a standard application which is installed locally. So yes, in my opinion, supplier assessment should include certifications which are not part of standard supplier assessment, including, for example, cybersecurity.
Yeah, I'm sure that ties into what you mentioned about the subject matter expertise as well.
Yeah.
So next question would be another question on regarding the source code review. So it
Yes.
mentions that on the GAMP5 equipment, for simple codes do not require source code review. Could you explain a little more on what are these simple codes, as the definition of simple could differ between the software vendor and the manufacturer?
Simple codes, it was more referred to the GAMP categorization actually of the coding of the software. So we need to think about how the component is built up if we're talking about customizations or configurations. If we're talking about customizations, we need a subcode review. If we're talking about configurations or even standard components which do not need the verification of or the editing of the source code, we do not need to include a source code review. But I'm not fully sure I understood properly the question. I don't know if this was the focus of the question. I think yes. But...
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
So next we have another question. Could you briefly comment on the application of the robotic process automation, whether that's the repeatable step and possibly using of the artificial intelligence like the ChatGPT? How do we foresee such applications being introduced, and what are some of the potential challenges?
Well, the use of robotics and artificial intelligence in the regulated industry is, of course, probably the most important and also interesting update. And it's also the one which brings the main challenges. So one of the main risks, in my opinion, is the reliability on the automation part, talking about robotics, because we have a switch between the concept of technical qualifications, which we are used to know in a regulated environment. We usually have the technical qualification and the computer software, computer system validation, which are working together. If we are introducing robotics, technical qualification will be strongly reshaped, and it is already actually based also on guidelines regarding this. Same thing is related to artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence for running regulated processes. In my opinion, it is very hard to follow an approach of categorization, for instance, GAMP categories that we used to know for software applications. So I am personally also very curious to see how this will actually develop and how it will be possible to follow an approach which is actually covering all the possible applications of artificial intelligence in the regulated environment.
Yes, it's indeed a very interesting development, because that will be something that we will be looking forward into, how to ensure that critical thinking approach throughout that process.
How can we be sure this will be actually working like we see it in theory? We will see it in the next years, I guess.
Yeah. Do we have any further questions from the audience? Please feel free to leave any questions you may have on the chat. If not, I think we are close to the end of the session. Thank you very much.
Sorry, I have a question.
Okay.
Go ahead, please.
First of all, thank you for your valuable presentation. It was very enjoyable. I'm sure it was helpful to everyone. I have a question about critical thinking. Could there be an option to not create URS in the future? Because sometimes creating the URS is either too simple or the same as a technical specification. How can we prevent this?
Well, I don't think it will be possible not to create specifications at all, because specifications are still the baseline for defining the effort for testing, whether it is scripted or unscripted. We need to define requirements and to define the specifications related. But what can be done and what can be merged is the kind of specifications which are issued. So instead of issuing, for example, functional specifications, design specifications, it would be possible to apply critical thinking to rely more and more on all the functionalities and components which are standard, without the need of extensively documenting every single specification set forth by the system, and to focus only on the parts that really critically need to be tested and challenged for ensuring the reliability of the system itself. This can be leveraged probably.
Thank you, I see.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you.
Thank you. With that, I think we would end today's session. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for joining, and have a good remaining day or evening, wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.